Breaking Bad is full of complex characters, and what makes them interesting isn't just what they do, it's why they do it. Every major character has this one core flaw that drives all their decisions and ultimately leads to their downfall or their suffering. We're gonna break down each character and figure out what that fundamental weakness is. Let's get into it. Walter White, ego as identity. Walt's biggest flaw is that his entire sense of self-worth is tied to being recognized and respected, and once he gets a taste of that through Heisenberg, he can't let it go. Here's the thing about Walt, he's not actually cooking meth because he needs the money. I mean, yeah, that's how it starts with the cancer diagnosis and the medical bills, but pretty quickly it becomes clear that money is just the excuse. What Walt really wants is to feel important, to feel powerful, to feel like he matters. Because for years, he's been this overqualified high school chemistry teacher watching former colleagues win Nobel Prizes while he's explaining the periodic table to teenagers who don't care. That resentment has been building in Walt for decades. He sold his stake in Grey Matter for $5,000 and then watched Gretchen and Elliot become billionaires. He's been teaching the same classes for years. His students don't respect him. His own son looks up to Hank more than him. His wife treats him like he's helpless, so when Walt becomes Heisenberg, when people start fearing him and respecting him and talking about him like he's this criminal genius, that's like a drug to him. That's what he's actually addicted to, not the money, the recognition, and you can see this throughout the show. When Gretchen and Elliot go on TV and say Heisenberg had nothing to do with Grey Matter's success, Walt is furious. When Jesse suggests that maybe they should cook for someone else, Walt can't stand the idea of not being in charge. When Hank is getting close to catching Heisenberg, Walt is almost proud because it means someone finally sees how smart he is. Walt tells himself over and over that he's doing this for his family, but that's a lie. Skyler literally begs him to stop. She shows him a storage unit full of money, more than they could ever spend, and asks him to quit. And Walt can't do it, because it's not about the family, it's about Walt needing to be Heisenberg, needing to be the man people fear and the respect. He's mistaking power for self-worth, and that mistake destroys everyone around him. His ego is so tied up in being Heisenberg that he'd rather watch his family fall apart than go back to being nobody. That's his fatal flaw. Jesse Pinkman, craving love and moral anchoring. Jesse's biggest weakness is that he desperately needs approval and belonging, and he keeps looking for it in people who hurt him. Jesse actually has a really strong moral compass. He feels guilt about things most people in the drug trade wouldn't even think twice about. He's devastated when that kid Thomas gets killed. He can't handle it when they dissolve bodies. He breaks down over Combo's death. But Jesse's got terrible self-esteem. He thinks he's worthless, thinks he's a screw-up, thinks everyone who's ever given up on him was right to do it. His parents gave up on him. His teachers gave up on him. He bounces from one bad situation to another because he doesn't think he deserves better. So when someone shows him even a little bit of affection or validation, Jesse latches onto them. Walt becomes this father figure he's desperate to please. Jane makes him feel loved and seen. Mike treats him with respect and Jesse clings to that. The problem is Jesse keeps confusing approval with actually being cared about. Walt doesn't love Jesse, Walt manipulates him, but Jesse wants Walt's approval so badly that he can't see what's really happening until it's too late. And Jesse is constantly torn between wanting to be good and thinking he's beyond redemption. He'll try to do the right thing, but then someone tells him he's worthless and he believes them and goes back to doing whatever he's told. Jane sees this in him. She tells him he shouldn't be hard on himself, that he's better than he thinks. But even that relationship becomes toxic because they're both struggling addicts who bring out the worst in each other. Jesse's tragedy is that he actually is a good person with a conscience, but he's so desperate for someone to tell him that, so desperate for approval, that he keeps ending up in situations where people use that need to control him. He can't forgive himself even when he's right. He carries guilt for things that aren't his fault, and that makes him vulnerable to people like Walt, who know exactly how to exploit that guilt and that need for validation. Gustavo Fring, obsession with control and image. Gus's biggest flaw is his need for absolute perfect control over everything, which is really just emotional armor to protect himself from ever being vulnerable again. So Gus presents himself as this calm, methodical businessman. He's always measured, always professional, always 3 steps ahead. His chicken restaurant empire is the perfect cover for his meth operation. Everything is calculated, but that extreme control is actually coming from a place of deep trauma. Don Eladio killed Max right in front of Gus years ago. Max was Gus's partner and possibly more than that, and Gus had to kneel there and watch him die and couldn't do anything about it. Ever since then, Gus has built his entire life around making sure he's never vulnerable like that again. He controls every variable. He plans years in advance. He never lets his emotions show. He turns his desire for revenge into this long-term, elaborate plan because that's the only way he can process what happened to Max. But that level of control is isolating. Gus doesn't have real relationships with anyone. He doesn't let anyone close. His entire empire is built on suppressing emotion and maintaining this perfect professional facade. And once Walt starts cracking that facade, once Walt makes him angry and gets under his skin, Gus starts making mistakes. He gets sloppy with Lalo. He underestimates Walt's desperation. The mask slips, and that's when his carefully constructed empire starts falling apart. Gus's flaw is thinking that if he controls everything, he'll be safe. But you can't actually control everything. Life doesn't work that way, and his obsession with control means he can't adapt when things go sideways. He mistakes control for safety, and when he finally loses that control, he loses everything. Hank Schrader, masculinity and pride. Hank's biggest weakness is that his entire identity is built on this performance of masculinity and toughness, and he can't let anyone see weakness. So Hank is a good DEA agent. He's competent, he cares about his job, he genuinely wants to catch bad guys. But he's also got this whole persona of being the tough guy, making jokes, drinking beer, acting like nothing bothers him. But underneath that, Hank is dealing with a lot of trauma. After he gets into that shootout with Tuco, he starts having panic attacks. After the cousins attack him in the parking lot and nearly kill him, he's physically and emotionally destroyed. And Hank can't deal with any of that in a healthy way because his sense of self is wrapped up in being tough. He can't go to therapy without making jokes about it. He can't admit he's scared or hurt, because that would make him seem weak. So he bottles everything up and covers it with bravado. And that works okay until he figures out that Walt is Heisenberg. When Hank realizes the cook he's been hunting for over a year is his own brother-in-law, it destroys him. Not just because Walt betrayed him, but because it means Hank looks like an idiot. The criminal was right under his nose the whole time, and Hank's pride won't let him handle this smart. He doesn't call for backup. He doesn't build his case carefully through proper channels. He confronts Walt immediately because he needs to be the one who brings Walt down. He needs to prove he's still the tough, competent agent. That pride gets him killed. In that desert, when Jack's crew shows up, Hank knows he's dead. But even then, he won't give Walt the satisfaction of begging or seeming weak. He'd rather die with dignity than live with humiliation. Hank's flaw is that he's so committed to this image of masculine toughness that he can't be vulnerable or strategic when he needs to be. Skyler White. Moral rationalization. Skyler's biggest weakness is her need to maintain some kind of moral control, even as everything around her descends into chaos. So Skyler is smart, really smart. She's good with numbers, she's organized, she thinks ahead. And when she finds out Walt is cooking meth, her first instinct is to try to manage the situation somehow. She can't stop Walt. She tries divorcing him, tries keeping him away from the kids, but Walt always finds a way back in. So eventually Skyler decides that if she can't stop it, she'll control it. She'll launder the money properly. She'll keep the books. She'll make sure the criminal enterprise is at least run professionally. This is Skyler trying to wrap chaos in procedure, trying to make sense of something senseless. If she can understand the money flow and manage the cover story, then maybe she still has some control. Maybe she's not completely powerless, but what's really driving this is fear. Fear of losing control of the situation, fear of losing the moral high ground, fear of admitting that she's become complicit in Walt's crimes. Because once Skyler starts actively helping, once she buys the car wash and starts laundering money, she's not just a victim anymore. She's a participant. And that's terrifying for someone whose identity is built on being the responsible, moral, controlled person in the family. Skyler isn't corrupted by greed. She doesn't want the money or the lifestyle. She's corrupted by her need to make sense of the situation, to impose order on chaos, to believe that if she just manages things correctly, then maybe everything will be okay. But you can't rationalize your way out of being married to a meth cook. And Skyler's attempts to maintain moral control just pull her deeper into complicity. Mike Ehrmantraut. Emotional attachment disguised as professionalism. Mike's biggest flaw is that he thinks he's a cold professional when really he's driven by sentimental loyalty and emotion. Mike prides himself on being the guy who just does the job. No unnecessary violence, no drama, just efficient professional work. He's the cleaner, the fixer, the guy who handles problems. And Mike definitely has more of a code than most people in the drug trade. He doesn't kill unless it's necessary. He tries to minimize collateral damage. He's got rules about not involving civilians and especially not involving kids. But Mike's not actually the emotionless professional he pretends to be. His entire motivation is his granddaughter. Everything he does, all the money he makes, all the risks he takes, it's all to leave her money so she can have a better life than his son did. And Mike is loyal in ways that a true professional wouldn't be. He's loyal to Gus even when it stops making strategic sense. He cares about Jesse and tries to protect him. He keeps supporting his guys in prison because he feels responsible for them. Mike's flaw is this moral selectivity where he convinces himself he's better than someone like Walt because he has a code. But his code is kind of arbitrary. He'll kill a person to protect the operation, but he won't harm a child. He'll work for a drug empire, but he judges Walt for being too ego-driven about it. And his sentimental attachments are what get him killed. He sticks around trying to take care of his guys instead of just disappearing. He stays in Albuquerque because of his granddaughter. He lets his guard down around Walt because some part of him still thinks there's honor among thieves. Mike mistakes having ethics for having a moral high ground. But really, he's just another criminal who's convinced himself his version of the game is more honorable. And that blindness to his own complicity is his weakness. Gale Boetticher, naive idealism. Gale's biggest flaw is that he romanticizes science and intelligence to the point where he's blind to the moral implications of what he's doing. Gale is this sweet, nerdy guy who loves chemistry, he's passionate about it, sees beauty in it, gets excited about molecular structures and purity percentages. And when he hears about Heisenberg's blue meth, he's fascinated. He wants to learn from this genius chemist, but Gale doesn't think about what the meth actually does. He doesn't think about the addicts or the families destroyed or the violence that comes with the trade. In his mind, he's just doing science, creating a product, pursuing knowledge. Gale has this libertarian philosophy where he thinks drugs should be legal and people should be free to make their own choices. And that's fine as a philosophical position, but it lets him avoid grappling with the reality of what he's participating in. He worships Heisenberg. He writes in his journal about how brilliant Walt is. He doesn't see the darkness in that genius. He doesn't see that Walt is a monster who destroys everyone around him. Gale just sees the chemistry, and that naive idealism is what gets him killed. He trusts Gus, trusts the system he's working in, doesn't see himself as being in danger because, in his mind, he's just a chemist, doing a job. Gale mistakes intellect for goodness. He thinks because someone is brilliant at chemistry, they must be worth admiring. He can't see that intelligence and morality are completely separate things. His flaw is tragic because he's genuinely not a bad person. He's just so caught up in the intellectual beauty of what he's doing that he never stops to consider the ugliness of the context. Jane Margolis, self-sabotaging defiance. Jane's biggest weakness is that she defines herself through rebellion and resistance, and she can't stop sabotaging herself even when she knows better. So Jane is smart and self-aware. She's been through recovery, she knows her patterns, she knows what triggers her. She's got her life relatively together working for her dad and staying clean. But Jane has this compulsive need to rebel against anything that feels like control. Her dad is trying to protect her, and she resents it. The structure of sobriety feels restrictive, so she pushes against it. Authority of any kind makes her want to do the opposite. And when she falls in love with Jesse, that relationship becomes wrapped up in this same defiance. They're both broken people, and there's something romantic about that to Jane. They're rebels together, outcasts together. But Jane knows what's going to happen. She knows if she starts using again, she's probably not going to stop. She knows Jesse is bad for her sobriety. She tells herself she can manage it, that this time will be different, but deep down she knows. And part of her wants it anyway. Part of her wants to self-destruct because that feels like freedom. Burning everything down feels like autonomy, even though it's really just another form of being trapped. Jane's love for Jesse is genuine, but it's also laced with this fatalism where she's almost welcoming the inevitable crash. She's trying to save Jesse while simultaneously destroying herself, and she can't see how those two things are incompatible. She confuses independence with self-destruction. She thinks rebelling against structure and control is freedom, but really, she's just enslaved to her own worst impulses. Saul Goodman or Jimmy McGill. Insecurity, disguised as cynicism. Saul's biggest flaw is his pathological need to be taken seriously combined with his deep belief that he never actually can be. So underneath all the tacky suits and the sleazy commercials and the jokes, Jimmy McGill is actually brilliant. He's a master manipulator, an incredible improviser, genuinely clever at finding solutions to impossible problems. If he'd been born into different circumstances, he could have been a legitimate, successful lawyer. But Jimmy grew up as Slippin' Jimmy, the con artist, and his brother Chuck spent Jimmy's entire adult life telling him that he'd never be a real lawyer, that he didn't have the character for it, that he was fundamentally not serious enough to deserve respect. And that wound defines everything Jimmy does. He wants so badly to be taken seriously, to be seen as legitimate. That's why he works so hard to pass the bar. That's why he wants Chuck's approval so desperately. That's why he's so hurt when HHM won't hire him, but at the same time, Jimmy doesn't actually believe he deserves that respect. Chuck got in his head, so Jimmy performs this cynical, sleazy persona because if everyone thinks he's a joke, at least he's in on the joke. At least he chose it. Saul Goodman is Jimmy's way of protecting himself from wanting things he doesn't think he can have. If he's deliberately tacky and ridiculous, then he can't be disappointed when people don't respect him. He's controlling the rejection. But underneath all that, Jimmy is still desperate for validation. He wants Mike to respect him. He wants Walt to see him as an equal. He wants Kim to think he's good enough. The tragedy of Saul is that he actually is a genius, but his insecurity makes him waste that genius on increasingly degrading cons and schemes. He's so convinced he can't be legitimate that he proves Chuck right through self-fulfilling prophecy. Todd Alquist, moral vacancy. Todd's biggest flaw is that he doesn't have a flaw in the normal sense. His weakness is the complete absence of moral reflection. Todd is terrifying because he's not evil in the way most villains are evil. He's not cruel or sadistic. He doesn't enjoy hurting people. He's actually weirdly polite and respectful most of the time. But Todd has no internal moral compass whatsoever. He just follows orders and seeks approval from whatever authority figure is in his life. When he shoots that kid after the train heist, he's not trying to be evil. He just sees a witness and eliminates the witness because that seems like the logical thing to do. Todd doesn't feel guilt or empathy. When he's keeping Jesse in a cage and forcing him to cook meth, Todd doesn't see that as torture. In his mind, he's just managing a business arrangement. When he kills Andrea in front of Jesse, he's just using the most efficient method to control Jesse's behavior. This is what makes Todd so disturbing. He's not empty in a tortured way. He's empty in a functional way. He imitates morality, says please and thank you, tries to do what he thinks is right, but he doesn't actually feel any of it. There's no arc for Todd, no moment of realization or growth because there's nothing inside him to realize or grow. He's just a void that follows instructions. So yeah, that's the core flaw for each major character. What's interesting is how these flaws interact with each other. Walt's ego manipulates Jesse's need for approval. Gus's control issues clash with Walt's need for recognition. Hank's pride makes him vulnerable to Walt's manipulation. Let me know in the comments which character's flaw resonates with you most, or if you think I missed something important about any of them. These are complex characters and there's always more layers to explore.